this was always, as primacy is, it's a house of cards. It invites the challenges that then it says that it is the only solution to vanquishing, and then it becomes increasingly less able to actually do the vanquishing.
Hello everyone and welcome to Security Dilemma, a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. I'm A.J. Manuzzi, joined by my co-host John Allen Gay, as we have a conversation with Spencer Ackerman. Spencer is a Pulitzer Prize and National Magazine Award-winning reporter who's covered the war on terror and U.S. foreign policy for a number of outlets, including The New Republic, Wired, Guardian, The Daily Beast, and Zeteo. He's the author of the book Reign of Terror, How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump, as well as the Forever Wars newsletter, and he's currently writing the new Iron Man series for Marvel Comics. Let's jump right into our conversation with Spencer Ackerman.
Spencer Ackerman, thank you for coming on Security Dilemma. You've covered the war on terror effectively since its inception for a whole host of publications that I won't list here. How did a grand strategy of U.S. primacy lend itself to this crusade as the sort of operating logic?
So, first of all, any primacy strategy is going to naturally provoke opposition. That's the nature of seeking primacy. When you seek primacy, you have no choice but to either obtain it and maintain it or continue to seek it. So nothing could be better suited to an overwhelming and often mutating, often incoherent response to a primacy challenge like 9/11 than the strategy that the United States has been pursuing since the end of the Cold War. It would naturally interpret an attack like 9/11 as a challenge to primacy, and then it would seek the rallied and continued allegiance of its coalition as a cost of maintaining primacy. And you don't often see this because this is a fairly unique historical situation that the United States is in, but you don't often see global primacy, but you very often do see regional primacy pursued. And in that case, frontline states that adopt a regional primacy posture very often expect to extract some forms of security or economic rents from the states that they claim to be acting as security providers for. So the United States is really teed up for the war on terror from essentially both interest, or perceived interest, I should say, not actual interest, but habit and muscle memory, really since 1991, when you could argue further back since the beginning of the Cold War, but certainly since 1991, when the United States is the only global superpower, for an attack like 9/11 to be translated into a primacy hoarding construct, if you want to look at it that way, like the war on terror.
Your book, Reign of Terror, which was out a few years back, we hosted a reading group on it here at the Society with some of our folks in our DC network, as well as an online session. It's a real tour de force history of the GWOT. And what do you think most jumped out to you about the war on terror as you were writing this book, as somebody who lived it?
A lot of different ways to take that, but certainly the human cost. I've reported from Iraq, I've reported from Afghanistan. Unlike a lot of reporters, I didn't live in those places for extended periods of time. But I went multiple times, been to Guantanamo Bay, been on a whole bunch of both domestic and overseas U.S. military installations, been on a bunch of Navy ships, been on a bunch, even was on a submarine once. And the human consequences of a 20-year war are the first thing that get abstracted when discussed in policymaking circles. And the first time I went to Iraq, I realized, and that was 2006, and I was 25 years old, I realized that without even realizing that I had done this, that I had seen those people as abstractions, as not people in their own right, but because of the terms of the debate about the war on terror being, 30,000 feet above sea level, it naturally lends itself to that kind of abstraction of human beings, of treating them like means to an end, even when you don't mean to, but treating people who are desperate to survive the extreme violence of the war on terror as sort of automatons to be fit or sometimes to be sacrificed within this. And that was a major turning point for my view of US foreign policy in general. I'll just give one example. There was a young Yemeni man named Farai al-Muslimi in, I believe, 2013. He testified to Congress, and he was trying to explain to Washington what it's like to grow up with armed drones over your country constantly. Now, one thing about the Predator and Reaper drones that the United States pioneered and built throughout the war on terror is that it's a loud machine. Its engine's ancestor is a lawnmower engine. So Faria made it clear to me that you hear the buzz and the whine of the drone even when you can't see the thing. And that's basically the sound of the angel of death. And when viewed in those terms, you kind of can't go back to these kinds of abstract notions that, these are, pick the cliche, tools in the toolbox of US policymaking, because those are human beings that those things kill. And Freya told me, as a way of explaining the social impact of living under the constant threat of annihilation by drone, is that parents, I don't know if you gentlemen have children, but I do, parents discipline their kids by telling them that if they don't go to bed on time, they're going to send a drone for them. Now, just imagine the psychological impact of that, about having in a kind of bleakly humorous situation that when mixing with everyday life, your parenting responsibilities of getting your kid to bed on time when they're misbehaving and they don't want to do that, reflected through the prospect of imminent death that can come at any time, directed by people very far away who will never know your name, who will never know what your lifestyle was, and who will justify it by saying you had some nebulous affiliation to terrorism, and no one in the media will ever check that. They'll presume that your death was justified. I would say that's the thing that whenever when I wrote Reign of Terror and when I approach my coverage in general, I try and make sure that we don't fall back on these kinds of dehumanizing abstracts of four suspected targets wiped out in an airstrike in eastern Syria or coastal Somalia or on and on. But instead try and make it clear to a readership back home that might not, be considering that the people being targeted are not necessarily, scary villains who are coming, to cross vast oceans to kill your grandma, but people like you and me who have no choice but to live through a terrifying circumstance.
Yeah, you've talked a little bit about just the hum of the war on terror, just as a perpetual force, not just in American politics and American society, but of course, the physical drones hovering over the countries in which the United States has a military presence. I want to ask, we're often presented as like in a post, not just a post 9/11 moment, but a post war on terror moment by policymakers, whether it's, calling to shift for, confrontation with China or, reassembling the primacy coalition around a different cause. What do you make of assessments that the war on terror is over?
I would say if that's the case, then we would be dismantling the surveillance architecture that we constructed in the years after 9/11, predicated on it being a way to address the emergency that 9/11 presented. We wouldn't be occupying eastern Syria with absolutely no United Nations mandate, with no certainly welcoming from either the old or the current host government. We would have abolished the institutions of the war on terror that were set up to be, again, institutional responses to a transformed, as was often said, security picture. And we would be repealing the legal architecture, the authorities that gave birth to continued operations of the war on terror, the so-called AUMF, the authorization to use military force, after 9/11 in 2001, and subsidiary AUMFs like the one to overthrow Saddam Hussein, which is still absurdly in effect. So, what of the war on terror doesn't exist anymore? Well, you have the apparatus of torture that the CIA built up. You have the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Those are, you know, they're not insubstantial. The absences of those things matter a lot. But more often, what you see is continuity rather than departure. And with continuity comes a potential to repurpose it. Right now, not only are we seeing Guantanamo Bay refilled with migrants who are claimed to be the worst of the worst, just like the Pentagon said after 9/11 with the cohort that it took in when it constructed the wartime prison there. But we're also seeing right now, shortly before we recorded this, CNN and the New York Times reported, and this is clearly based off an official briefing, that the CIA is flying drones over Mexico as a way of taking the authorities and the capabilities that it had after 9/11 and adapting it now to a quixotic attempt to suppress fentanyl coming into the United States and attack the cartels in Mexico that have proven resilient throughout the past several decades. So the point that I'm drawing at is that without the abolition of the capabilities, the institutions, and the authorities of the war on terror, I would argue that we can't meaningfully be in a post war on terror era. What we have is something created that, as my friend Kerry Howley of New York Magazine once put it really well, has simply become the background noise of U.S. foreign policy. These institutions, as I'm sure you're well aware, operate on muscle memory. They operate on precedent, and they remain adaptable to future missions because future missions mean future budgets and future career opportunities for those who wield these institutions. So I find it facile and somewhat propagandistic to say that we're in a post-war on terror moment. You have no shortage of politicians in both parties proclaiming that, but when it comes time to actually move toward the abolition of these things, the appetite for that simply doesn't exist. You see some of that in both left and right fringes of the congressional parties. You see some of that in broader think tank and activist discussions. But the further up you get toward the centers of power in both parties, the appetite for that fades away.
Yeah, and I mean, just I feel like another recent illustration of this was that when Tulsi Gabbard was under consideration to be ODNI, to
Yes.
be the director of national intelligence, she kind of had to recant her earlier criticisms of the Section 702 surveillance authority, which I see very much as being justified in terms of monitoring for terrorist threats and internationally connected terror threats. I wanted to maybe get your response to what I'd say is maybe like my attempt at the best case you could make for the war on terror, and maybe this is a bit like when Lisa Simpson gives Homer the tiger repellent rock, and he thinks it keeps tigers away because he never gets attacked by tigers when he's holding the rock. But you could point to you could look back on the war on terror era and compared to the post 9/11 moment, right after 9/11, everybody thought like, wow, this is the new era. American life is going to be defined by the threat of terrorism. If you saw an airliner flying overhead and anything seemed unusual, you're like, okay, is that plane hijacked? Is it flying into, the heart of the city to kill people? You had, people stockpiling, Cipro, the antibiotic to protect themselves from anthrax, duct tape and plastic sheeting to seal up their houses against biological attacks. There was this moment of extreme fear. And, there were some data points to point to that besides 9/11. You'd had the Cole bombing, the embassy bombings, et cetera. Al Qaeda had some signature successes. And then you look at the moments after that, and you haven't seen that kind of pattern. And it seems like the Al-Qaeda threat that we knew in 2001 has gone away. That the organization is radically weaker than it was. Similarly with ISIS, that ISIS was defeated on the battlefield, and that in both cases, the power of the brand of these terror groups was diminished in this kind of slow, steady grinding away, that they were distracted by fighting by resisting the counterterrorism effort, and were thus unable to plot, that their best people got killed in the drone war. And now you have, the biggest threats seem to come from lone wolves who are like radicalized by stuff they read online. And you even see people talking about other forms of extremism other than Islamic extremism being like the main form of terror threat nowadays. And so you could look back at that and say, okay, like, doesn't that mean that the war on terror was successful on its own terms of largely protecting the United States from terrorism and tamping down Al Qaeda and then its kind of replacement, ISIS?
Well, I would disagree with that in a couple fundamental ways. First and most fundamentally, I'm writing a book right now, which is about a young man who joined Al Qaeda after 9/11, someone who grew up outside of Baltimore as a Pakistani immigrant. His name is Majid Khan. And he's someone who goes to Karachi in 2002, which is pretty much the epicenter of Al Qaeda global activity after the fall of the Taliban prompts Osama bin Laden and his coterie to move across the border. And this was clear before my interviews, but is definitely clear now. Al Qaeda didn't have a second plan. Like the weakness of Al Qaeda was the first thing to be obscured in the American discussion of how the response to 9/11 should unfold. Instead, it was treated, I would say, like it wished to be treated, as a global vanguard of a rising jihadist movement, which it never really had claim to. However, it's extremely useful to pretend that it did and to assess that it did. And I shouldn't use the word pretend because, covering it at the time, very dedicated public servants, regardless of, choices that they made that I disagreed with, took this very seriously and felt that they had no choice but to presume the worst in order to theoretically guard against it. The trouble with that is now we're not talking about reality. We're talking about a paranoid perception around which to construct a global war. Now, if you look at Al Qaeda right before the invasion of Iraq, it has to kind of take a lot of steps to demonstrate its relevance. Much smaller scale, but still, horrific atrocities, like an attack on a U.S. consulate in Karachi in the spring of 2002, the Bali bombing, the Jakarta hotel bombing in 2003. Horrific attacks like that, but nevertheless not on the scale of 9/11. And at that point, you have a clear indication that the organization itself is indeed reeling. There was a manhunt for it indeed underway. But the invasion of Iraq breathes new life and new purpose and new radicalization material, as did the opening of Guantanamo Bay, into the organization, to the point that very soon in 2004, Al Qaeda functionally loses control of what came to be known as Al Qaeda in Iraq, and that becomes the nucleus of ISIS. And the point that I'm getting at is to look at it from the opposite perspective that you laid out. This war generated its own enemies. This war scaled its enemies up. The capabilities of Al Qaeda in Iraq were not, to attack the United States at home. It didn't find itself with that kind of capacity, but instead it found itself assembling an army that the pre-invasion of Iraq Al Qaeda simply did not possess, and had a regenerative capability that it did not possess. Why did it possess that? Why did it create that? Because the material conditions that the war on terror created, especially the invasion of Iraq, prompted resistance. resistance that the United States chose to interpret as only new members of Al-Qaeda fighting for the same purpose, to, oust the United States from blah, blah, blah. Very often, the material basis of Al-Qaeda's critique took a back seat to the rather conspicuous religious elements of its case against the United States. Those material conditions allowed the enemies of the war on terror, which were always shifting, to scale up and to create new challenges that the United States then had to address. You saw this after the surge in Iraq. The United States proclaimed that because it had suppressed the organization, that now it had functionally, if not quite defeated it, reduced it in its threat level to something that the United States, through continually occupying and policing Iraq under different names and different authorities and different mechanisms, could manage the situation, until it didn't. And then ISIS came to be, sort of forged both through the invasion of Iraq and then the Syrian civil war, which also had a substantial contribution from the context of the war on terror. And then at that point, you have ISIS as a, frankly, just far larger and more apocalyptic and deadlier threat than Al-Qaeda ever was, that the United States went back to war to suppress. And currently, the caliphate has fallen. It had, unlike Al-Qaeda, territory that it had to defend, and accordingly could be defeated in that respect in more conventional ways than could Al-Qaeda. At the same time, what is Eastern Syria now? Eastern Syria right now is a collection of city-sized Guantanamos at camps like Al-Hol, which has essentially a prison population of 50, never convicted, so I shouldn't say prison, but a detainee population of something like 55,000 people, funded entirely by the United States, policed entirely by a Kurdish entity that the United States, without any international legitimacy to it, is functionally guaranteed a statelet, which is provocative to Turkey, and it creates enormous question marks around the future of Syria. And in exchange, it perpetually suppresses the emergence not only of ISIS, but of tens of thousands of people who are relatives of ISIS, or who had in fact fled ISIS territory but had all gotten swept up. One of the things we learned through the creation of ISIS is that the condition of detaining people within these kinds of detention camps, certainly not the scale of these detention camps, because that's an innovation, but throughout the war on terror, among the things we saw was that the future leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was in Camp Bucca, and so was the current leader of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara, Abu Muhammad al-Jawani. What do we expect is going to happen to the tens of thousands of people that the United States has essentially garrisoned in, I shouldn't say garrisoned, imprisoned without any process or trial rights in Syria by tens of thousands, by the scale of tens of thousands? The point that I'm getting at is, by its own terms, the war on terror generates its enemies. Whatever victory that it maintains is ephemeral and constantly threatened, and that becomes an argument for perpetual maintenance of this imperial policing strategy. Accordingly, you can't say when it could possibly end, because it doesn't have a connection to a strategic endpoint. It only has a political declaration. And at that point, one declaration is as good as any other. So you have moments of reprieve in the war on terror. 2012, before ISIS, you could have made that case that you just made to me, and people would probably, nod their heads and be like, yeah, I guess I can see that. Osama bin Laden is dead after all. I would argue that the death of bin Laden was probably the greatest political opportunity to actually declare that thing is over and begin dismantling it. But now you have a circumstance where, to go back to your point about 702, you have a sort of, from a perspective of liberty-eating governmental power circumstance, where it's sort of a heads I win and Al-Qaeda/ISIS/whatever is suppressed, or a tails you lose situation where, because they're not quite suppressed, we need these authorities even more. If they are suppressed, you need them to maintain the suppression. And if they're not suppressed, you need them to impose suppression. So you get something that can't really be said to be a success, because, especially from, the original point about the weakness of Al-Qaeda at first, they had a one punch, but not a two punch. And all the United States did after that was give them greater opportunities for other punches.
How do we get out of all that then? Because it seems like we've politically and institutionally would have trouble extracting ourselves from this because of these kinds of arguments. But then also, given that the war on terror kind of makes its own enemies, how do you stop it and then have those enemies be out there? Like, I guess I'm trying to see what's the better future that's possible, and how do you get from A to B from
So
where we are now?
there are two elements to your question. I don't presume that either of them are politically easy, but if you were interested in solving the problem, you would do this along two axes. One, Al Qaeda and now other successor or would be successor jihadist entities, regardless of how strong they actually are, have a material basis. They do not exist in a vacuum, right? They didn't come out of nowhere. They're not pursuing what they're pursuing because of strictly religious interpretation. They're doing this because the United States has, for decades, and as the successor to the French and British imperial powers in the Middle East, adopted an imperial position with all of its exploitative and extractive elements over the Muslim world. Particularly over the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant, but also in Southwest Asia as well. Without addressing those material conditions, the United States, which does not wish to address those material conditions because they are central pillars of primacy, particularly when it comes to energy resources, that will always invite challenges. That will always, particularly from people who not only have a religious interpretation to American policy in their region, but also have the bitter and very recent, from their perspective, memory of Western imperialism in that region, and particularly with the United States, as we've been seeing horrifically since October 7th, but for many, many decades before that. You can certainly go back to Kissinger and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, although there are precedents from before that. But American support for Israel, and particularly military support for Israel, is a central basis attracting those that the war on terror considers enemies. Without addressing that, you can't address any of this. There is a tremendous allergy in Washington policy circles for accepting that American strategy, especially in the Middle East, is what drives the enemies of the United States in the Middle East. It's much easier, it's more psychologically satisfying, and it is better able to obscure the unjust, extractive, and exploitative elements of the American presence in the Middle East by just pretending that these are all fanatics and they'll attack the United States no matter what. That's nonsense. The second element that you would have to pursue to end the war on terror is through concerted political action. I don't pretend that that's an easy thing. I can only tell you that it is a necessary thing, because the politicians, and especially the security state, will never end this state of affairs on their own. It benefits them too much, not just in terms of budgets, not just in terms of influence, but the easiest path to a political career in the United States, especially now, is by identifying an enemy, whether foreign or domestic, and positioning yourself as the implement that will vanquish that enemy. That is something that is a political current that is certainly not unique to the war on terror. Nevertheless, the war on terror fuels it and provides it very, if I can mix a metaphor, very fertile soil for it to take hold. Like I say, neither of those prospects are the most, shall we say, imminent on the horizon, but they do point a way for how the end of this could actually be achieved. And then it becomes a question of whether those in power wish it to be achieved, and whether those of us who are outside power are willing to form coalitions in order to force those leaders to abolish the war on terror. That may not be a satisfying answer for you, and I fully concede that, but that is how I view it.
I've often seen the phrase going around that outside pressure makes inside pressure possible. For example, on ending the war on terror and on a bunch of these other movements for less militaristic U.S. foreign policy. I want to pull on the thread of your central claim in the book that the war on terror helped produce the politics of Trump, and the Trump-ish politics emanated from his movement. we kind of came of being here at JQA in the aftermath of the 2016 primary. You had candidates in both parties, at least feeling the pressure to renounce primacy, or at least elements of primacy. On both sides, you had Bernie Sanders, Henry Kissinger's "not my friend," to Hillary Clinton. You had Jeb Bush being publicly humiliated by Trump mentioning his brother's support for the Iraq War. What do you think Trump understood about the war on terror and primacy that Democrats didn't in both 2016 and in the most recent election, 2024, to give you a chance to broaden it?
Yeah, so Trump understood two things that the Democratic Party, sort of at the beginning of the war on terror, in kind of let's say, a rising fear of the gut, got, but then decided to position itself athwart. So the first is that the war on terror isn't really a new thing in American history because it relies politically on a lot of nativist currents and militarist currents that it then provides wind in its sails for, an opportunity to ride back into power through. The Bush people understood very well that the war on terror's real political force domestically was to provide outgroups that it could single out and then associate with its political opposition in order to deny it power. And that worked really, really well until it didn't. So that was the first thing Trump understood. The second thing was that there was a far greater appetite for the subtext of the war on terror, the civilizational sense that the United States was riding into battle against a foreign, implacable enemy that would otherwise come to its shores. Then there was actual enthusiasm for the wars themselves, especially, and this is really the Trumpist innovation that even Bernie came to in 2016 far more cautiously, and then far more full-throatedly in 2020 as some of his competition caught up to him, which was that outside of Washington, the war on terror is a source of pain, not pride, but humiliation. That for the United States to have billed the wars as these opportunities for the restoration of like clear, unambiguous American power and success, that their circumstance of achieving neither of them, but really keeping the United States in kind of perpetual political situation of agony in which you have neither peace nor victory, was something that was going to infuriate a lot of the people, particularly on the right, who had bought into the war on terror because they had thought that this was going to be a consequence-free victory. And that was a bitter experience. And particularly when you get out to the working class that has to fight the war on terror, the experience of having that denied, and while simultaneously experiencing austerity at home, was going to be a profoundly volatile political circumstance that was going to wait for someone to champion it. And it doesn't matter that Trump is not an anti-war figure. During his first term, he accelerated drone strikes, he didn't stop them. The one thing that I would argue he did that would count as a net positive for ending the war on terror was the deal with the Taliban. And then he disclaimed it once Biden actually pursued its follow through. Biden also violated some aspects of that deal, but I can digress on that. The Democratic Party instead had one moment in 2008 where it also captured that anti-war anger in a manner that kind of shocked the establishment. And that was Barack Obama's candidacy. Obama, however, had a far more circumscribed critique of the war on terror. And then, in order to pursue his presidency with one eye mindful on the prospect of getting blamed for a subsequent terror attack, ended up embracing most of the kind of, shall we say, sotto voce, more clandestine and in the shadows operations of the war on terror. And that kept the thing going. And accordingly, it got worse and worse and worse. That's where I think you really see the imprint of the war on terror on the Trump presidency. And in 2024, Trump also captured a lot of Now, some of this also, plays on a bit of a superficial level, but nevertheless, political reality kind of creates itself sometimes with the kind of partisan polarization of like Biden for the thing and I, a Trump supporter, am against it. Trump is for the thing, I, a Democrat, am against it. And you saw that a lot with a lot of Trump supporters and, him through the campaign, whether he was talking about Ukraine or he was talking about other elements of the war, as an anti-war figure that Trump was never going to be. Even an anti-war figure, even as he was threatening, as we see him now taking shape to do, pledging to wage an aggressive war in Mexico, supporting Israel's genocide of the Palestinians of Gaza to the hilt, to the point where he's potentially completing it. You don't have to actually be the president that you campaign as to harness what I believe is still the kindling out there politically amongst regular people, that perpetual war is a losing circumstance for the people who have to wage it and who have to live with its consequences.
Yeah, it's really interesting to track the trajectory of sort of Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. And there's certainly an element where maybe it's like the meme from The Office where it's like corporate wants you to tell the difference between the two pictures. And it's, it's the same
And they're
picture.
the same picture.
What do you think, if anything, has changed in Trump 2? I know it's early. The personnel is somewhat different. I know there were some appointees that basically weathered campaigns against them, shall we say, from more hawkish, more primacist folks, particularly with regard to the Middle East. But, you look at Secretary of State's Marco Rubio, very establishment figure. But it still very much also feels like Trump oscillates between the desire to end wars and the desire to take the gloves off. There was a tweet from Matthew Petty of Reason a bit ago that was like, MAGA can't decide whether it wants to leave the Middle East or own it forever. So I'm just wondering what your take is on the differences between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 and the continuity.
And it seems like that impulse there kind of gets to something you were talking about, this humiliation, the humiliation of not prevailing in the war on terror can lead to two conflicting impulses that sound like that. One is let's take the gloves off and wipe out the Middle East. The other is let's get the heck out of there. Let these people fight each other.
This is a war of this is a war promoted by cosseted elites that we're here to purge and to vanquish. But at the same time, we can't afford to have our martial superiority put to the test by people that we consider practically subhuman. So certainly that. Okay, but lots of different alliances of forces have changed between the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration. Given that we're a month in, I don't know if we can really predict the course of these developments. But a couple things. First, during the first Trump administration, you had a lot of figures from the security state, especially pedigreed from the war on terror. Jim Mattis, H.R. McMaster, Rex Tillerson is a bit of an odder case, but certainly him, who sought to constrain Trump and maneuver the MAGA energies toward traditional Republican primacy-seeking foreign policy. They clashed with Trump. They accommodated Trump. Eventually, they fell out of favor with Trump. Jeff Sessions is another good example from a different element of the first Trump administration. And here you don't have that. Rubio is definitely, along with Mike Waltz, more traditional establishment figures, but how traditional really are they, given that, Rubio's pedigree is the Tea Party movement. That's how he became senator in Florida. And Waltz's pedigree is, to a great degree, the war on terror and the transformation of the war on terror into more of a kind of generally foreign policy constructive construct. Then you have people who are populating the Trump administration who don't have that same traditionalist pedigree, but do have deep experience in the war on terror. Pete Hegseth, veteran of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo. Tulsi Gabbard, veteran of Iraq. Joe Kent, who is now the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, who lost his CIA wife in Syria. Those forces represent the id of the war on terror. The sense that not only is this, a field where we are we must not be challenged militarily because there's sort of that, lingering commitment, but also that this war has been a horror. But as they get closer to power, they don't wish to take their hands off the levers of that power. You mentioned Tulsi Gabbard learning to love Section 702 surveillance that in her previous life recognized was overwhelmingly invasive, incompatible with how we tend to view freedom in the United States, and extremely constitutionally dubious. Now that she is director of national intelligence, oops, never mind. You would see, I would expect from both Hegseth and the Rubio Waltz axis. You also see this in Hegseth's Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Bridge Colby, a strong willingness to transfer that war on terror as a civilizational and governmental construct that will strengthen us politically away from the missions of the war on terror and toward a broader Cold War against China. That looks like is going to be, as we saw Biden pick it up from Trump and now Trump picking it up from Biden, as it expands, a more holistic construct for what U.S. foreign policy might be going forward, I would argue, at a time when the world could afford it the least. But also you have the wild card that we're watching essentially execute a coup against the existing constitution right now, with the Silicon Valley venture capital defense contractor axis represented by Elon Musk, certainly with Doge, but also with its allies of the Teal coterie, whether it's Palantir or Anduril. These are massive defense contractors that also control, in many cases, mechanisms of communication like X that are now extra constitutionally licensed by the president to run rampant and seize a tremendous amount of data, which is exceptionally lucrative for strengthening their own market position and their own wealth. That looks like something different that we did not have in the prior Trump administration, while simultaneously the Congress is talking not about, helping the benighted working man of MAGA, but imposing austerity upon it. So we, where these constellations of forces go, we're still watching. We're still seeing what opposition, both externally and internally, they confront, and what forms accordingly they'll adapt to.
Maybe I'm forcing a comparison here that isn't apt, but perhaps opportune. You write in the book about, and in your broader work as well, that the war on terror, as much as Obama initially campaigned against, as you mentioned, a circumscribed critique of the war on terror, ultimately he and his administration pursued a bureaucratized, managed version of the war on terror, thinking they could kind of make it comply with the law and also not be caught, kind of holding the bag were some sort of major terror attack to occur. And I'm curious what similarities you see or through lines you see between that and Biden, who came to power being a foreign policy president, capital F, capital P again, who talked about wanting to, in the words of Jake Sullivan, forge a foreign policy for the middle class to save primacy, essentially, and the liberal internationalist foreign policy strand. What through lines do you see between Obama's bureaucratization of the war on terror and the Biden administration's sort of last gasp attempt to harness primacy towards foreign policy for the middle class?
Well, first, the same people, like exactly the same people. They just got the next rung up in the Biden administration. But, name your person, right? Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Samantha Power, John Feiner. But on and on down the list, you saw the people who met Avril Haines, especially. You saw the people who constructed this highly bureaucratized engine of lethal force applied worldwide in the war on terror, thinking that they would kind of wrap what they viewed in the Bush administration as lawless operations within a belt of law. But the thing is it wasn't law. It was procedure and it was precedent. The Biden administration, like the Obama administration, was filled with lawyers lawyers who can make themselves experts of process, but not people who can generate law, because that's not how the American system works. However, on foreign policy, these things substitute for one another. And both Obama and then certainly the Biden administration flattered itself that it was acting lawfully, when in fact it was abrogating to itself all of this power while telling itself that this would be a more, if not necessarily lawful, although they would use that term, regularized and predictable, stable way of managing US foreign policy, even while it engaged in all of these extra legal practices. The way I put it in the book was Obama thought that he could make the war on terror respect the law. In fact, he and others made the law respect the war on terror. And you provide for essentially the erosion of the rule of law, both at home and what counts for it abroad, while posturing as being the lawful alternative to something like the chaos and the dictatorial impulses of someone like Trump. And these are not substitutes for one another. They seed the bed for someone who will then take all of this institutionalized and acceptable lawfulness and corruption and say, like the Usher meme, watch this now. So that's how I kind of view the through line, for it. One of the things that I think will stand as the kind of epitaph for Biden's foreign policy is his insistence that around the world, the United States promoted the rules-based international order. And the rules-based international order is something that sounds a whole lot like international law. And there are many circumstances where the interests of both international law and the rules-based international order coincide. But really what the rules-based international order is a liberal construction of the same old strategy of primacy and hegemony that allows itself the willingness to violate international law when the operations of international law conflict with the prerogatives of U.S. global power. That, I think, and we see in Gaza what the wreckage of international law by the United States leads to, the mass destruction at scale of human beings. That, I think, is the Biden administration's legacy, and everything else is a detail compared to it.
In some of Patrick Porter's work, when he makes the argument that, okay, you can talk all day about a liberal international order or whatever, but it's clear the United States is still like the driving force behind it. It is the enforcer, and it makes itself the enforcer of it. And if you have an enforcer who does illiberal things to advance this liberal cause, allegedly, because it sees itself as the enforcer, well, how liberal is that?
Yeah, and
or rules-based.
That's right. Well, I mean, I would say just on its own terms, it is not rules-based at all. It sure is an order. But accordingly, you will invite, as we started out discussing with any strategy of primacy, you invite challenges to that. One of the most important challenges that we saw early, from a historical sense in the construction of the rules-based international order, so-called after 1991, is the speech that Vladimir Putin gave at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where he says, look at the wreckage that you have created after you have said that only you are the sole repository of international law and order, and I'm not going to play by those rules. They disadvantage me and they constrain my power. And I think a lot of people who were critics of the rules-based international order, that is to say U.S. primacy and hegemony, clapped along because now there is going to be some form of counterweight to the United States internationally. But what they didn't get was that Putin was saying, I want what you have, and I'm going to demand what you have, and I'm going to operate as if I already have it. When you see the United States say that China is violating the rules-based international order, it wasn't doing so at all. The trouble was it got too rich within the U.S. the rules-based international order by being the world's factory floor and by inviting in international capital, and especially capital from the United States, and facilitating the destruction of U.S. manufacturing. And at that point, China wants what any rising power would want under that construct, the same thing that the United States has in its own spheres of influence, in order to say that we are the dominant power over here, and we will not accept that you simply declare yourself to be the lawful, natural hegemon over the entire world. This was always, as primacy is, it's a house of cards. It invites the challenges that then it says that it is the only solution to vanquishing, and then it becomes increasingly less able to actually do the vanquishing and requires more to continually get to older versions of the maintenance of global power. This is a death spiral. The United States' foreign policy should be understood that way. Primacy should be understood that way. This is not, I think there's a lot of kind of weak liberal objections to this thing that talks about it in the name of like, it's not a sustainable thing. Well, you pour enough blood and money into it, and it sure will be sustainable. But the issue isn't really its sustainability under its own force. It's whether it is able to achieve better outcomes for both itself and humanity, and it's just not, and it won't, and it's not built to. It's built to enrich a very, very small class of extremely wealthy people. Trump is not an alternative to that. Trump is an exponent of that. He's both a symptom and an accelerant of that. And those are the axes on which I think we come to a better understanding of U.S. foreign policy if we adopt, rather than a kind of, left-right framework that overlooks a whole lot of material and class-based reality. The United States does not need a foreign policy for the middle class. It needs a foreign policy for the working class.
It certainly feels like there was a significant bit of momentum built up in the years leading up to the Biden administration towards a more generally progressive foreign policy. I don't know how much of that was just reflexive impulse anti-Trump, but you could very much make the argument that the Ukraine war or the Afghanistan withdrawal and the media's response to it in particular were major turning points in stymieing this momentum. What do you think was a proper catalyst for a democratic retreat from even Obama-era foreign policy, much less, the broader project?
I might quibble with it as a retreat from Obama-era foreign policy, because I think there are ways in which the Biden administration was kind of, on the one hand, filled with people who viewed Obama's foreign policy as a kind of chaotic failure that they wished it hadn't been, and they were going to try and seek something that looked more stable accordingly. You also saw that in 2016. That was, again, with a lot of the same people. Hillary Clinton's critique, however, diplomatically voiced, of Obama's foreign policy. But nevertheless, what Biden should have done, let's take the Afghanistan withdrawal, for instance. That reminds me, I think you're right, that represented a moment of retreat from the broader goals to kind of end endless wars, which had become a bit of a 2020 mantra without actually getting around to the actual ending of them. But that reminded me of the near miss plane crash Christmas Day 2009, in which now it looked, although on a lower potential scale of magnitude, considering deaths from 300 people in a plane and 3,000 people on 9/11, it looked nevertheless like the Obama administration had not sufficiently been attentive to the war on terror. The only solution to that would be greater intensity of war on terror. You saw that with Biden and Ukraine, with viewing that accepting something of the narrative that the United States looks weak because of the withdrawal, but not contesting, and accordingly, needs to look stronger in the context of Russia that has its eyes on Ukraine like a cartoon dog looking to eat a cartoon chicken. But instead, what it could have done was argue that the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan was chaotic because the war was lost. That a withdrawal from a lost war is messy and ugly, and the lessons of that are not to do these sorts of things in the first place, not to be enmeshed within the structure of a losing war for so long, and continually orient your foreign policy around the idea of peace building. Not peace is the absence of war, but peace is something that be actively constructed and maintained and given a material basis for. The Biden people didn't really do that. They weren't really interested in it. They were interested in leaving Afghanistan as a way of kind of checking the box off of a prior commitment that many of them, and I've interviewed many of them over the years, genuinely recognized was a disaster for the United States, but didn't permit themselves to take the critique of the war in Afghanistan beyond the war in Afghanistan. And that, I think, was a central flaw. And you can sort of see that in its willingness to support Israel, no matter what Israel does, which admittedly is not a critique that the Biden administration alone carries. It is rather, unfortunately, mainstream position in American politics and foreign policy. But that's just a sampling of the ways in which Biden squandered a moment of opportunity that he had.
Last question before we get out of here, if that's all right. What worries you about the war on terror coming home in a Trump administration, but also in a world kind of in the aftermath of the Biden administration, the crackdowns on student protests around the country?
That's right. I would say a number of things, and they illustrate the massive danger of the institutions, operations, and the culture of the war on terror. The Trump people in Congress are looking to essentially deport people who support Palestine. They'll bring, and this is something that Biden started, bringing the Department of Homeland Security into closer partnership with campus administrations that are willing to betray their academic mission and suppress the free speech of people who advocate for the divestment of those institutions that they attend and pay tuition to from the Israeli war machine. That is a major five-alarm fire. Similarly, there have been and continue to be, we just saw one of these in Miami, vigilante attacks on people who aren't necessarily even Palestinian, Arab, or Muslim. Not that that excuses it, but the point is that the culture of perpetual fear and hysteria gives license to vigilantism. We saw this throughout the war on terror in places like North Carolina, in places like New York, I'm sorry to say as a native New Yorker. That scares me a lot. Similarly, with the impulse to expand deportations toward, pretextual violations of counterterror law, you could not derive a better tool for that than the continued maintenance of Section 702, which will be voted on again in April, but now has vastly diminished opposition on the right, because there's no longer the argument that, this thing is a tool to suppress the right, but an opportunity to suppress the left, which is what it's interested in. Those are things that frighten and bother me. We've already seen on the global stage now the introduction of drones over Mexico. It is a matter of time before this expands even further. The Pentagon people focusing on China will be happy to use the institutions and authorities of the war on terror. You're also seeing with immigration the expanded use of the ultimate Department of Homeland Security creation institutionally of the war on terror to conduct nationwide roundups of people who will then be sent to Guantanamo Bay and called the worst of the worst. So you really see the residue of all of these operations given a greater nativist bent and a weaker opposition to them. And of course, Trump, unlike a lot of his far right, both antecedents and allies around the world, won the 2024 election, fairly decisively. I would argue that the proper way to understand this is that when you see Trump getting fewer than 1 million votes over the last, compared to the last time he ran for president, but the Democrats losing something like 8 to 10 million, that this was in fact a referendum on Biden, that Biden and then Harris lost rather than Trump won outright. But 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. The fact of the matter is that Trump won the popular vote with a substantial margin. And he will use that as political license for things that, as we're seeing Elon Musk do right now, no one actually voted for, but nevertheless are moments of opportunity to be seized. And the institutions of the war on terror are there to help a lawless president accomplish this.
Spencer Ackerman, thank you so much for coming on Security Dilemma.
Hey, thank you so much, gentlemen.
Security Dilemma is a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. To learn more about our programs, visit our website at jqas.org. Remember to rate and review on your podcast app and join us every Tuesday for new episodes of Security